of Kaduri's farm. Okay, of Kaduri's farm transformative education programs, particularly of an unfolding initiative of which this talk is part, which is the Kaduri Earth Program. The Kaduri Earth Program is an initiative that is being co-created by Kaduri Farm and its network of collaborators and volunteers, integrating the various strands of the farm's nature conservation, sustainable living, and holistic education, with the purpose of helping people, helping ourselves, helping one another to let go of the ways of thinking that have created the problems that we are now facing collectively. So like in Einstein's famous quote, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used to create them. So this is the purpose of this unfolding initiative. And we are inviting thinkers and practitioners that will help us in going deeper, in shifting our ways of thinking, and then as a consequence, our ways of being and our ways of relating in the world. And that's why we're so delighted to have Craig Holdrege here with us today, who is the founder of the Nature Institute in the United States, writer of the book Thinking Like a Plant, amongst others, and amongst also many articles, and who has been dedicated to research and to teaching that helps us to see the living world in a dynamic way, overcoming hopefully the separation between us and nature. And so going at the root of the crisis that we are, the crisis of disconnect that we face now as in a collective level. So we are very glad to have you with us today, Craig, and very glad for all of you who joined us. So just some practical notes before I hand it to Craig. This session, as you heard from Zoom, this session is being recorded, and it will be made available upon request. So if you'd like to watch, to listen to the session later, you can ask Natalie in the same email that you have received the link for the talk. It will be available for a month for you to request it. And about the flow of our session, so Craig will start sharing, and then throughout his sharing, we want to encourage you to share questions or comments or reflections throughout in the chat. So then he will pause, Craig will pause at certain points in the presentation, and I will share, I'll harvest these questions and I'll bring to him. And then, of course, we are a size that allows us also to open our microphones and interact. So if you want to make any, to say anything further about your question or comment, you're welcome to open your mic and do so. And I'll invite anyone to do that if you feel that you would like that. I think this is enough to say, and then we'll take it as it goes. So thank you again, Craig, and I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk and hopefully contribute something worthwhile for you all. And the title of the talk, How Green is My Thinking, What Plants Can Teach Us, really does refer to what Juliana was just speaking about, which is how is the way we think about the world affecting our actions, the way we view the world, and what we make of the world. So often we're not so conscious of the way we think because that's part of our cultural heritage. We are in a context, we learn through education and through the media just to think in a particular way. And we think that's maybe a reflection. The way we think about the world is an actual reflection of the way the world is. But throughout human history, of course, there have been major shifts in the way people view the world in different cultures and over time within a given culture. And so in the Western world, and the so-called scientific revolution, starting 16th century or so, in Europe, there was a major shift in the way of thinking that basically influences everyone today around the earth. And we often take that for granted, and it has brought many fruits, and it has caused many problems. And this question is, well, how does one begin to shift into a different way of viewing the world? And the approach that I'm taking here, and that I take in my work altogether, is to say, well, can I learn from the natural world itself, from the living world itself, how to be more in tune with the world in my thinking, instead of imposing a particular conceptual framework upon the world? Can I, so to speak, read from the world its qualities so that I internalize those and they become more part of me, so that then not only my thinking, but then my actions can be more in tune, in harmony with, or you could say also furthering the health of the world. That's a big task. And I can no means say that I can solve this problem. It's a huge one, and it's one that's going to be with us, I think, for a long time. But I think we can take steps. So I would like to do that in just a very particular way. There are other pathways that one can go, but I will take a particular one in this talk. And I'd like to begin just by showing you one example of what I'll call the problem. I could show many different ones, but I'm just going to show one. So I'll be showing some slides and then turning off the slides and coming back in. Okay, so the first slide I'd like to show, I'm not able to move it. I'm going to see what's going on. There we go. Just different images of water. And we all know water very well. We wouldn't be alive without water, the water that we drink, the water that's in our food, the world of water. And it's a world of movement, of drops, of flow, of turbulence. It's an amazingly dynamic world, and it's a very interesting world in as much as you can compare it, for example, with a rock. When a pebble, like here up at the left, when a pebble falls into a body of water, what does the water do? It does not break. It reacts as a whole body in these undulating waves and then calms down again. If a water drop forms and comes into contact with other water, the two come together. They connect again. Water is an amazingly is an amazing phenomenon in the world that one can study to see connectedness, flow, dynamics. And it's very interesting that when studying, for example, biology, and then learning some about water, of course, qualities of water, I was taught to think about water in particular ways. And for example, some of these images you can see on this slide, where we think about hydrogen, we think about oxygen. There are very interesting experiments that one can do to show how water can arise through hydrogen and oxygen coming together, how they can be destroyed when hydrogen and oxygen appear. And we begin to think about water, excuse me, in terms of its component parts. And for example, if we want to explain why a small insect can walk on water and explain surface tension, we do it by thinking about water being composed of individual molecules that are interacting. And then we create a model of all these different parts that are to explain to us how the whole functions. So this is called, sorry, I'm going to drink a little water. It's early in the morning here, so I'm speaking first thing. I haven't been speaking much yet. All right. And so our thinking in the way looking at water thinks in this way that it says, yeah, water is composed of parts. So how can I understand the whole out of the parts? This is what's known as reductionism. And it's a very powerful methodological approach. One can learn a lot, one can discover a lot, one can do many things. But what's interesting is that you also really lose something. You lose the coherence, the unification, the connectedness of water as a phenomenon in the world. You're thinking separateness to explain connectedness. And that is really at the foundation of the way most of us learn in science education, I'll say it in science education, to think about the world, always from the component parts, how genes, how hormones affect us so that our bodies are formed in a particular way, etc. I don't want to go into that more, but just to say it's an interesting characteristic that we often take for granted. And in a way, you could say it's quite strange to always be interpreting what's a world of connections and interconnections in terms of disconnect, of terms of separate entities being fundamental. That's, atoms are fundamental, molecules are fundamental, genes are fundamental. So we have that tendency, and it's a very strong habit of thought that we often don't reflect upon. So what I'd like to do here is just to show you how one can begin to learn now from plants, that I'm not going to take water as my example, but plants, how one can learn to think in a plant-like way. Now, not that plants think, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is can we learn to think in a living way, the way that plants live? And this approach that I take in my work, and that lies at the basis of the work at the Nature Institute and of other places, of course, in the world, goes back, one of the main streams that it goes back to is the poet and scientist Goethe, who was a German, and he's most well known as a great German poet, but he also inaugurated a way of doing science that one can call holistic, one can call it phenomenological, one can call it contextual. You could have all sorts of different terms for it that are kind of abstract, and I want to give you a concrete feel for that through my presentation, what that can mean. But he says it here in these words: if we want to gain a living understanding of nature, we must follow her example and become as mobile and flexible as nature herself. And that begins with careful observation of the phenomena themselves, without at the very beginning saying, I want to explain it. I'm not looking at it to explain it. I'm looking at it, considering it in order that it can teach me something about the way it is in the world so that I can understand it better. And that it's a powerful educational approach, because you become closer to the world, you get closer to the phenomena of the world, and learn actually to see how amazing apparently very simple phenomena are. So I'm going to be showing you things that are easy to observe. We often don't observe them, but they're easy to observe, and to think about them and their significance and what they mean. So I'm not going to be going into lots of technical, botanical details or biological details that only a specialist could understand, but in a way that I hope you can see how this is an educational approach, and an approach to understanding. The scientific approach can be quite fruitful. So I want to show you now a number of slides, and then we'll talk a bit about those. Very, as I said, quite simple, apparently simple phenomena. So this is a drawing of a sunflower seed that is starting to germinate. And I'm just going to show you now a few slides. So it's already an interesting fact that when we follow a process, say, of plant growth, here of germination, that we as human beings always have snapshots of the process. We don't perceive its continuity. So here, the snapshots are 5 different drawings. Or you come every day and you look at the plant for 10 days, and you see it one day, and you see it the next day, and you see it the next day. So you have a discontinuous relation to the plant, where the plant is doing something continuous. It's not these snapshots. These are holding on to moments of a process. So the plant is beginning, no, I'm not going to say beginning. It is going through a process here that if we want to do justice to it, we need to, in our thinking, I could also say in our imagination, but not fantasy imagination, but with our ability to connect what is for us separate phases into one process. If we don't realize it's one process, then we're not doing justice to the plant. The plant is a process. It's not a thing. The closest it gets to being a thing is when it's a seed that's not germinating, a seed that we're going to plant in our garden, a seed that we collect from the field. That there a plant has is a discrete entity. It's separate. It seems to be doing nothing, and it is the most separate phase of the plant's life. And then, and this is where I'm saying the simple is amazing. All we have to do is to put the seed into a particular environment, from the dry glass that we've had it in over the winter. And then we put it out into the garden soil, comes into a dark, moist, warm environment. And what happens? Many things could happen. It could be non-viable, it could die. An insect could carry it, could start chewing on it and kill it. A bird could carry it away. Many things could happen, but it could also germinate. So what does that mean? Suddenly, in this new environment, it changes its whole relation to the world because it's now in a different world. If you understand what I mean, it's now in a context that it can relate to. It opens itself for that interaction, which is quite a miraculous thing. If you work with children, this is one of the most wonderful things to observe, how plants germinate, how seeds germinate, to see within a few days how the seed has swollen, gotten much bigger, filled with water, and then the little root begins to emerge out of the seed. And what is developing is growing. So all of this that's in this part of the seed that's starting to grow down is new tissue. It's not what was in the seed before. It's now growing out. So this whole phenomenon of growth that we take for granted means every time something's growing, it's creating something new that didn't exist before. And it's be able to do this because it's come into an environment that supports it. Through the environment, it's doing that. I'll come back to all this in a different way later. And what does the root do? In growing, it grows down. Well, of course, we know it grows down. What does that mean? It means that a taproot, so the roots that grow down before the roots start branching out to the side roots, it's growing towards the center of the earth, right? So that if you're growing carrots in Hong Kong and we're growing carrots here in New York, and carrots in Australia and carrots in somewhere in Europe, they're all growing towards the center of the earth. Every germinating seed relates to the whole earth. This is an important thing to realize again in terms of connectedness. Once a plant begins to germinate, it's taking up a relation to the whole earth, but in a particular place. It's not isolated anymore, it's connected. And so it has this double relation of being place, being rooted in a place, specific, and having a connection to the whole globe through the fact that it grows down towards the center of the earth, which is called positive geotropism, right? And that the stem that's growing out of the seed as well, that here, that it is then doing the opposite. It's growing away from the center of the earth, up, and then you have the unfolding into the leaves. I'm not going to go into the more details of this at the moment. What I want to give you an impression of is how the plant is always in relation to the world in which it is growing. And it's living from that. And I'm not going to go in now to photosynthesis, this absolutely miraculous process of out of water and carbon dioxide through light and in a warm world, in a somewhat warm world, can't be too cold, the plant can create its own living substance. So it's kind of densifying the qualities of the environment of water and carbon dioxide into living substance. So it's in relation to the air, it's relation to the water, in a way that it creates something wholly new on the planet, living substance. And so we have these two aspects. The plant is a process and in transformation, and that process always arises within the context of what we call the environment of the plant in a specific way. So I'd like to go into these two aspects now in more detail and begin with transformation, with the quality of transformation. So these are poppy seeds. This is the field poppy, and I will now show you some pictures of how this plant develops. This was an experiment that someone did many years ago with whom I studied, and he grew many plants in so-called root boxes that allowed him to follow the growth of the roots, because they were in boxes with one side had glass and at an angle, so that the roots would grow kind of towards the glass in the soil, towards the glass, and he could then trace, or have his students and artists trace the growth of the roots to see what's the dynamic of root growth in the soil. So that's just, you get a sense of how you can see roots, because they were closed off to the dark, and they were in darkness, and then they would be opened up when they were drawn and then closed up again, because roots don't like light, at least most of them don't. So this is a 3-week-old plant, and you can see that it's taking root very strongly. And I'd like to show you just now a couple of images of its growth, again, snapshots, every 2 weeks. So what separates, there's a 2-week period between every drawing. So a very quick, forceful development within these 2 weeks. So it's now 5 weeks since the seed was sowed. As you can look, and you can all see what I can see, at least in the 2 dimensions, right? We're just looking at 2 dimensions. The roots strongly down into the earth, strong branching to the side, and many leaves have formed. Another 2 weeks, and you can see, well, it doesn't look that different. But what I'd like to point out is that do you see that some of the leaves, and it's already actually in the second drawing, are beginning to die. And this is not a pathological process, this is a natural process. That when an herbaceous plant like this grows, while it's producing new leaves, old leaves are dying. While it's producing new roots, old roots are dying. It's always a process of the new coming into appearance, and some of the older parts that were very important 2 weeks ago can now be dropped away. This is a really interesting thing about plant growth that's quite different from the way we, as human beings or an animal, think of a dog or a bird, we don't grow in the same kind of way by continually dropping parts off that get old. I mean, we do it with our skin and things like that, but I mean organs, like a whole leaf or a whole arm or a whole finger. A very different kind of growth process in plants, very interesting. And then the plant shifts and starts growing upward. And you can see here how now these leaves at the bottom that were in the rosette here, most of them have died off. As it's now growing upward and growing an upward stem, you can see a bud up at the top, and you can get a feel for the fact that the leaves are, they're changing somehow in their shape and size. So I'd like to show you that it's not this particular specimen, from a different plant of the same species, how these leaves, the leaf shape and size is transforming in this process. So that what you see there in the bottom left is the first leaf on the main stem. It's a full-grown leaf. It doesn't get bigger. That's the second leaf on the stem. Full-grown, doesn't get bigger. So that's the same with all the leaves I'm showing you. And these are all the leaves from the main stem of this one plant. So that's something quite remarkable that most of us overlook in plants that are often considered weeds, annual plants that grow quickly. They go through an amazing transformation in the leaf shape. So what is a plant doing when it's growing? It's in ongoing transformation. It brings forth one leaf and then a next leaf, and each of them relates to what came before, but it's different. And it relates to what will come, but it's different. Right? So what we call transformation, change of form. The plant not only is a process, the plant is a creature of ongoing transformation. It doesn't stop. And it goes through this process is interesting because it has a very particular, dynamic and form to it, because you have simple leaves, then they get larger and more complex, and then they get smaller again, and everything goes away from being round to being more radial. And the last leaf on here is the last leaf before the flower comes. So all of this process of transformation in the green leaves that do photosynthesis, they are in this transformational process in such a way that they're also, you could say, the way the transformation happens is in preparation for the flower. It's related to what will come later. So it's a coherent process. So I just want to make sure everyone understood what I was showing you here. Sometimes I go too quickly and people, wait a minute, I didn't get what you were looking at. Is there any question to this or to what I've said up till now before we take a next step? We're not done with the plant development, but still I want to make sure everything's clear up to this point. Is there any problems, issues, anything you'd like to ask about?
Yes, feel free to unmute yourself if so, and share, because the chat has been silent. So feel free to speak if anyone. Yeah, some people saying that all good, fine at the moment. So it's good to have, yeah, not in this moment. Okay.
All right, good. Then I will, and please, I'm happy if you are, Now, I'm not happy if you are unclear, but I'm happy if you are unclear for you to ask, right? So just feel free to ask a question, and I can, and Juliana can stop me and say, Craig, wait a minute, there's a question. So, okay. So what comes next is the flower. So we looked at this whole transformational process, and then this is a red poppy that is a Mediterranean plant. I don't know if it's arrived in China and grows along roadsides or in fields in China, but it started in the Mediterranean area of Europe, and at least it is also in the United States. It's spread around the world, at least in the western part of the world. I don't know about in Asia. And it's a fast-growing, beautiful plant, and the field poppy. And so here the plant does something new, and yet it's building on what it did before. So as I said, this transformation of the leaves is preparing now the flower, is in the flow of allowing a flower to appear, and the flower takes the element of leaf and creates something completely new, the flower with its many parts. And the poppy flower, now, instead of having green leaves, has these red leaves that we call petals, has the hundreds of little stamens that form the pollen, and has in the center the fruit capsule in which the seeds develop. So it's a whole new appearance that comes at one time in a geometrical form that also has a whole new relation to the environment through insects, pollination. It's in a different phase of its development and relates to the world in a different way. No more photosynthesis. It's living from what was done in the past, and it's starting a new development. The petals in a poppy are very short-lived. They fall off very easily. And then this very complex process of pollination takes place, which I'm not going to go into in any detail. And I just want to follow the transformation. But just for everyone to be clear about it, if you see the green leaves of a plant, and all you had were the green leaves of the plant, you would never have any idea what kind of flower would arise from those. No idea at all. You can never say from the way the leaves are how the flowers will be. The flowers are like a surprise, a new development, but they're a surprise for us, but in the plant, they're in this overall transformational process, but it's not just one step. It's something really new. I want to come back to this in a moment from another side. So if we can just amaze, you can be amazed at all the different flower forms of different plants, that they come out of the green vegetative world into something new that is, for human beings, something beautiful, for insects, something beautiful, and for the plant, where it shows itself in a whole new way. In the poppy, the transformation happens in this way, that the bud, which very strange characteristic in poppies, that the bud, even though it's got lots of water, is always hanging, drooping like it's going to die, but it's not. It's actually waiting to then turn upright and then to open into the flower. And then the petals fall away, and the pollination, when pollination occurs, then in the middle, the fruit capsule, this beautiful form in the middle, begins to swell and begins to mature down now here in the lower left-hand corner. It's maturing, still green. And when you cut through that, do a cross section, then these hundreds of seeds are developing in the fruit capsule. So while, again, you have parts dying away, the petals die away, the stamens die away, the fruit is maturing, and then on the inside, now the seeds are maturing. Once pollination, of course, has taken place. And at the end, we get these hundreds of dry little seeds that the plant, that the capsule, when it opens, lets fall to the ground. And of course, then where those seeds end up, they might just decay in the soil. They might germinate in the soil. They might by an animal. All the unknowns of how the plant, one plant goes to many plants and not only propagates itself, but can become part of the soil, enrich the soil through decay with the help of fungi and bacteria, or it can feed animals. So it can go in different directions. And it's this abundance of plant life that one can be amazed at every time one sees one plant bringing forth many seeds, one tree bringing forth thousands and thousands of fruits and seeds. So an amazing abundance of life as the high point, you could say, of this ongoing transformational process that hopefully never stops unless the plant goes extinct, right? So to come back now, just to finish this, in the poppy as an annual plant, the process we were just looking at happens as the whole rest of the plant dies, right? This is only, I think, wait, I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, it's 13 weeks. And the whole plant has now come to an end. It will die, it will break down, it will become part of the soil. So it becomes part of the larger earth out of which it emerged, you could say. And then the many, many seeds that are in all the capsules go their way, as I just described. So this plant process of transformation. We followed a process. I hope you get a feel for that, and it's different. Every plant is a little bit different, but my aim here was to give you a feel. This is something to take transformation seriously, because when I learned botany at the university, I hardly ever learned about things like this. I learned about all the different parts. And actually, it was fairly boring because I never got a sense of actually what the plant as a whole plant was doing. So I wanted to give you a feel for this. And then the question is, to come back to the main topic, how green is our thinking? What plants can teach us? So I think I'll stop the share for a moment. And the question is, well, how can this help us to think differently? How can this help us to think differently? And let me just say a few things, and maybe you'll come up with some ideas or some insights, or you realize, aha, something. I'd love you to share that if you do. But first of all, so we follow the plant development, and we can see, okay, as a living being, and plants are those living creatures on the planet that give life to everything else, right? Through decay with fungi and bacteria, as food for animals and human beings, all of this life, the oxygen that we need to breathe, these life-giving creatures that themselves are alive, that live in this transformational process. If we were to think more like plants live, well, what might that look like? Just this far, we've got a whole nother aspect to look at in a moment. Well, we could say, we would expect, if in our thinking, instead of holding on to a particular concept, we would allow it to be in transformation. Rather than to say, this is the way things are, we would say, this is how things are at the moment. My thoughts have arisen out of a cultural context, out of my learning. I've gone through a transformation. I'm transforming. And every idea I have is a moment in a transformational process. And if we take the teaching of a plant that we just looked at, and we say, then I can bring forth new ideas, new leaves, right? Another leaf. Based on my experience, based on my learning, I'm new conceptions, but I'm also allowing my old ones to fall away. And imagine a teacher telling a student, it's okay to forget things. Do you understand? We're often, you have to learn new things and keep them in your mind, keep them in your head, because you've got to hold on to them. You've got to know them. But maybe forgetting is also an important part of learning. Forgetting, now I'm comparing with letting things fall away, concepts. So the idea that the insight, I'll say it this way, that our ideas can grow. And of course, they do this all the time, but we don't maybe take this so consciously. That we think we have an idea of something, and then we think, now we've got it. But as long as we stay in interaction with reality, that will change. Let me just give you one example. In the 1960s and 70s, the idea of the gene, the way I learned about it as a student, it had come to a certain solidity. It was pretty clear what genes do. And you could have many scientists writing about this, and the way I learned about it, it was very clear. DNA was structured like this. Genes consist of a certain amount of nitrogenous bases in DNA, and those then provide the code for the creation of, in the end, proteins. I'm not going to go into the details. It was pretty clear cut. And so that was, you could say, we know what's going on. And there were even people who said, yeah, we just have to figure out a few details. Then you look at what's happened in the last 50 years. And if you ask people what a gene is, who really work with these things, they say, I don't know. Because it's become completely clear by learning more about organisms and the way genes behave within the organism, that they're not at all really like what we thought they were in 1960 and 1970. It's quite astounding. So this is a learning process. You have to be willing to shed what you've had in order to gain new understanding. And the problem often is that the new understanding has to battle in human culture to come through, because we hold on to what we thought we knew in the past. this is so-called paradigm shifts in science, don't happen easily. They don't happen like they happen in a plant organically, right? It's often a battle. And so as a frame of mind, well, that's a bad expression. It's not a frame of mind. It's an attitude of mind to say, I want to hold my ideas tentatively. I have learned something, but I want to be able to have that transform. I want it to be able to go somewhere else. I don't live in the illusion that I've got it, that I've solved the problem, or that I have the full insight. This is an attitude of openness to the living processes of the world. I think it's really important. And I think I must honestly say plants have really helped me to understand that. So developing clear thoughts and ideas and insights through the interaction with the phenomena of the world, but always being willing to let them go. Another aspect is this interesting transformation from the greening plant to the flowering plant. Because a flower is a whole new appearance. And I've come to think of this in a way of when we gain sudden new insights. It's really interesting. Let me give you one historical example. There's a young professor of physics who was told he had to teach the students about the way Aristotle taught about physics in the history of physics. But he thought Aristotle's physics wasn't really any good. It was not, it was just, he wasn't right. He was wrong. Why should I teach about this? But he also knew that Aristotle was the father of logic, right? That he was a great thinker. And so he kept studying. And so what I'm comparing now this study, he went back again reading more Aristotle. I'm comparing this now to producing more leaves. He kept studying, he kept going back to it and gaining, okay, oh yeah, I'm understanding Aristotle a little bit better. Yeah, okay, this is what he says here. So he keeps going. This is kind of like this, the scholarly or the scientific process of just keeping with things, right? Keeping on a trajectory. And then what was very interesting, he describes, this is, by the way, Thomas Kuhn, who's a famous historian of science, who says at one moment, he was looking out of his window, he'd been studying Aristotle, and suddenly he realized, oh, now I understand him. Everything that he'd read up till now made sense in a new way in one moment. And these are what we call aha moments in English. I don't know if in Chinese you have a similar expression where, I've got it. Something comes together. That's a flowering of insight. You cannot make that happen, but you can prepare it by going back and back to things again and again and being open. Yeah, something's still there to be shown. So you have an attitude of, in a certain way, surrender to, well, maybe something can come. And it's actually often the case, and you might have experienced this, that this comes to you when you're taking a walk or when you get up in the morning. You suddenly see the things differently, and that transforms everything. Just like a flower is a complete transformation in the plant. And out of that, new capacities arise. and those are seeds. When we gain new capacities, they allow us to do new things in the world. So I really think that the mental process of learning in the human being in an internal way, right? This a learning process is that plants go through this in an external way that we can do internally. And that by studying the living world, we can also begin to model learning processes more according to living processes, because a lot of education doesn't do that. And I cannot speak about education, where you are, but in the United States, so much learning is based on knowing facts that are disconnected. When my son went to the university to study biology, he came home after the first semester and said, biology, I love nature, but all we're learning is disconnected facts. And that's not biology at all. Biology, the science of life, should be learning about how all the aspects are connected with each other so that you begin to understand the transformations, for example. So I think learning from the plant, this aspect of the plant, that there's a lot to learn there about the learning process in human beings and for education. So I want to stop there again for a moment, see if there's any comment or question before we venture into some other explorations.
I think we just had in the chat that there are field poppy also in Hong Kong. I think you had asked if people.
Good.
And well, if I was thinking, Craig, when you pose this question, how can this help us to think differently? I was also thinking of how we act in the world and how action tends to be something that we often separate ourselves to plan and analyze and predict as much as we can. And I was thinking, looking at what you've shared, how if we take action as movement, the movement is a response that we may call it's tentative, like it's a complete response to the surrounding or the environment, as we may call it. And so I was also thinking of that, like the implications of different ways of acting as something that is response-like action, that is different from the human action, which is always in order to, there's always a separation. Not always, but we tend to think that this is how it works best. I suppose.
Yeah, and I think, one thing one could say connected with that is simply that, you could say in the way that a plant is always in connection to the world in its transformational process, always relating to those conditions that are given into the situation it's in, to the phase of life it's in, and to the world it's in. I want to go more into the environment in a moment, but that if we look at our action in the way that everything we do creates ripple effects in the world that we're connected with, right? That we can't actually, we can separate ourselves in thought from them, but not in reality. They're there, right? And that we have that we're actually part of everything we're doing. Instead of seeing us as separate, we're actually part of it at all times. And it's just our consciousness that can we can separate ourselves in consciousness, but the reality for the world is we're part of it. Our imprint is there, and it will go its own way. It might decay, it might be taken up by someone else. And of course, we plan, and we have to plan. But again, I would also say, is that a solid idea, or is the plan open for transformation in relation to what it's going to meet? Yeah, and that's an important thing. I think I want to come back to that in a minute, or not in a few minutes later, after we look at a few other things.
Great, thank you. I have just seen that whilst you have been answering, there has been a couple comments. So one is from Vivian, and she's saying how identifying a plant is not easy. Then she gives the example that there is a plant she usually recognizes when it's a flower, but then when the flower is gone and becomes fruit, then she could no longer identify it. So I'll say the two comments, and then also there is a question from Billy saying also not just plants, but animals are changing all the time, aren't they?
Yeah. So yeah. So with the first one, it's very true. Most identification of flowers is of plants is through their flowers. Not so much trees. Trees can often identify by their leaves or by their fruits, but with herbaceous plants, you often, the flower is what tells you, and it's much more difficult to identify them by their leaves. The fruits one can to a degree, but it's interesting if you start looking more carefully at the whole plant and just don't ignore the leaves, but only look at the flower. If you start looking at the leaves, then you can begin to identify them through the way they transform, through the particular type of transformation. But it's, the young plants are very similar to each other often, right? And then you need the whole sequence in order to do that. But it's, again, how much we attend to it. But it's very clear the most distinct part of the plant that transforms the least in different kinds of environments is the flower. So that's an interesting characteristic. And of course, animals are also continually changing. It's just not so apparent in the sense that they're not, an animal is born or hatches as a whole body, and that whole body grows. It's not shedding, there are animals, insects that go through metamorphosis that's somewhat similar to plants. So the way they do it is quite different. But of course, as human beings, my skin is shedding all the time. I'm getting a new lining to my digestive tract all the time. My blood is changing. I have every 120 days, new red blood cells. So ongoing transformation, every organism is a process. And that we really need to see. We're dealing with processes, not with things in the world, not with static entities, but with living, dynamic processes. And that's what children need to get a feel for when they're learning about the natural world, and not just identifying, this is that and that's that, but to get a feel, this is how things are connected. And I want to go into the connected part in a moment.
Wonderful. We have just a couple of other comments, but I think there are more comments, just how ID comments, how observing plants' growth as transformation, and then this connection with internal transformation and people's ideas, how this is very interesting. And then also from Anita, that she's mentioning, I think, furthering, also reflecting on this, how humans, baby, child, puberty, fertility, pregnancy, menopause, how we can see all those as showing us these processes that human beings go through.
Yeah, exactly. It's showing, and also not only physically, but also everything that we call mental going on. You know, how does a young child relate to the world differently and then need to learn differently than, for example, so a child who's 4 years old is compared to an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old. Oftentimes we think, you know, we can just teach them in the same way. Well, are we taking into account that they're actually quite different creatures at different ages and that they're going through a transformation, and that their idea of a worm when they're 4 should grow when they're 8 and be different when they're 15, right? So yeah, the things are growing, developing, changing. Yeah. So I will move on because we're okay with time, but I want to definitely get to this last part, which I will share now, some more slides. Okay. So this is an oak tree. But you can think of any tree that may be growing in a park or somewhere else around you. And every tree has thousands of leaves. And it's a very interesting thing to, you know, you can say, well, I know what a maple leaf looks like, an oak leaf looks like, the needle of a pine tree, so I can identify them. And then you can look more carefully. And these are the leaves from one oak tree that grows in my yard at home. And the leaves were dying, but still on the tree in the fall. And then I pick them and then press them. And this is just a selection of the hundreds and hundreds of leaves that this tree had. And I just want to point to the fact that every one of them is different, right? We can identify them as an oak. I mean, we know they came from the same tree. I know them because I took them off the tree. And we can see, yeah, oak, yeah, but they're so different from each other. Just compare this leaf to that one, to that, in size and shape. So I want to kind of just, on a way, leave you with a question. Well, what's the leaf? What is it every spring when a tree brings forth all these leaves again, and each one of them is different from the other one? And yet they're all the same in the sense I can identify them, and they belong to the same tree. That there's an incredible potency and creative potential that lies at the heart of every plant. And there's a philosopher who studied this approach a lot, this approach of Goethe's, Henry Bortoft, who Juliana, of course, knows of. And he used a phrase, he says, every organism has the capacity to be itself differently, right? To be itself differently, meaning it's not always the same. There's something immensely flexible, potent, creative in every organism. It's not static. It's not in biology today, normal biology today, we use the term mechanism. You know, what are the mechanisms that cause something? It's actually a very inappropriate concept for the living world. And I'm not going to go into that more now. I'm just going to claim that. Out of such phenomena where there's always an ability to be different, it's never completely fixed. There is an openness. And that openness shows itself in the way plants interact with their environment. So this is a tree in the wintertime. It's a linden tree, a basswood tree. The genus is Tilia. If any of, I don't know if there are any Tilia species in Asia. I would kind of think there would be, but I don't know, sorry. And this was a tree, a basswood tree, that a colleague of mine many, many years ago, he spent a year drawing trees in the wintertime. And he drew just different specimens that were growing in different places, but all within a couple of kilometer area, not a large, he didn't travel around the world. It was just within a few kilometers of where he was residing in Switzerland, actually. And so here's a basswood tree. Here are 3 other basswood trees, same species. And here are 3 other basswood trees. And he drew more. And he drew them of different species. It was quite an amazing project. And these are all drawn to about to scale, more or less. So these are definitely, these trees here are a lot taller. Oops, sorry, got to go back. Are a lot taller than these more bush-like trees. And of course, all in their shape, very different from this tree that we more recognize as a typical tree. So here's an example of a tree species where, depending on where the seeds end up, what microenvironment they end up in, they grow very, very differently. And as I said, these are growing within a couple kilometers. And you could, if we had a longer time, we could, speculate a lot about, well, where they might be growing. What do you think? And some of you might know tree growth quite well and how trees grow in different places and have a pretty good sense, yeah, those are growing there, and these are growing there. So it'd be interesting for you just to think for a moment, yeah, what do I think? And then, that's like putting out a hypothesis, so to speak. And then one goes back to, in this case, the reality of it. Well, how was it? Where were they growing? And so where were they growing? In Switzerland, this was growing in a meadow. This was surrounded by grass, being no other trees. It was a tree standing by itself. This is the kind of tree we expect to see in a park, right? Or, where there's a lawn, where we've removed often other trees, and one tree can form and make actually a very short trunk, a short, thick trunk, and a big crown. These trees here were growing in a valley, a couple kilometers away from this field. So in a valley, in the Swiss valley, not high up in the mountains, not like, don't picture Switzerland high mountains, but just picture a lowland valley. And these were growing on one side of the valley and these on the other side. And this is the so-called northern exposure. This is the southern exposure. So that the sun, in the arc of the sun every day over the southern sky, these were in a sunny environment. These were in a shady environment, cooler, with less sun, cooler, more moisture, even though probably the same amount of rain fell here as here, but more of that rain evaporated, more of the water evaporated. And it's the same geology, but everything became different over time as this forest grew up, and the trees grow here more like bushes, and here tall trees all growing up together that shade each other and form a canopy of a dark, high growing forest. And this is only, if you were to fly from here to here, it would be less than a kilometer. So this shows you the plasticity of the plant, right? In one very powerful example, how it can change according to where it comes. It doesn't say, well, I want to be a basswood the same way everywhere I go. Right? Do you understand the difference? Like McDonald's is the same everywhere in the world, right? More or less, right? That kind of thing where you have something and it stays the same everywhere. Here, no. It stays the same in one sense. It's a basswood tree. Over time, there's evolution. I'm not going into that, right? But it has the flexibility to be itself differently, responding and integrating itself into a particular context and changing that context. This forest is very different because of the way the trees grow, very different plant community here, different kinds of plants here than there are here. So they are not only respond to the environment, they create and change their environment. So it's a complete weaving of organism environment. And every organism is expressive of the environment it lives in. It tells you something about it, and at the same time, it's changing. It's an incredibly dynamic, unified, connected process. I want to give one more example. This is again an experiment of an herbaceous plant where you can see the root growth. It's a mature plant. You maybe can see there are little tiny yellow flower heads here. This is a plant that's in the aster family. So the seeds were planted in these boxes, and the plants were watered, had soil, and were allowed to grow in a particular context. And that plant next to it is the same species, growing also in a box. But one aspect of the conditions was changed. Right? So it's not that there are different ages in the sense that this is also a flowering plant. Both of them are mature in the sense that both are at their flowering phase. So biologically of the same age, in days they might be different, but biologically they're in the same phase of their development. And just look how every aspect is different, right? Of course they have roots, right? They continue to have roots, but many, many more small roots, much more intensive branching, much bigger root mass. Here, you don't have the side branching nearly as much as you have it here. Here, this plant is much more deeply connecting with the soil, the particles of the soil intertwining with it. Here, you have more rounded bluish green leaves. Here, the leaves are more differentiated in their form. They go a little bit into the reddish coloring. The stem gets reddish coloring. Flowering, branching starts much earlier down here at these axils of the leaves. Many more flowers and a much more effusive branching up above. So branching, differentiation, branching. And here on the left, everything stays more simple. So there's something in the conditions that allows the plant to be different in those conditions. And what is it? In this particular experiment, it's one of the plants was growing in a shadier environment and the other in a sunnier environment. So you have this, again, the plant responds to differences in conditions, and the whole plant responds in a unified way. Here, more simple, compact forms, right? Not so penetrating into the environment in a differentiated way like this one does. But each is doing that in a way that's appropriate to that environment for that plant. So this is this amazing characteristic of the plants being eminently what I call contextual organisms, contextual beings. They are embedded in the world that they grow into. They bring that world to expression in their form and substances. They're showing us what light means for the plant, this plant, what more light means, what shadier conditions mean. They're bringing the environment to expression through their form and substance. And as I've said before, they're changing that environment. The soil here is very different because of all these roots than here, right? So we need to think about plants as connected at all times to the world in which they're growing, and connected in such a way that they have been transformed and they are transforming. It's an incredible relatedness of life. And we as human beings really need to learn this, because how often are we disconnected, right? Not integrated. So again, I can only point out, and we're almost at the end of our time, that this, for me, this is this question of when I do something, when I think something, when I do so, thinking is also a doing, right? When I have a concept, but when I'm also doing something, when I'm entering a new context, when I say, okay, I've got a new group of students coming to the Nature Institute, adult students. Well, what's the situation this time? Where are they coming from? How do I bring what I had planned into relation to who they are? How do I bring them in relation to the environment, the learning environment around the Nature Institute, the trees and the flowers and things? How do I integrate the learning into the environment, let them learn from that environment? How do I adapt to them? And how are they adapting to me? And to always look, this is an incredibly dynamic, rich learning process, so that I don't just place something in the world, but then I'm adapting to it. And for example, you know, when I'm giving a talk like this, it's kind of, I'm just putting something in front of you and hoping you're kind of coming along with me to a degree. But if a really living educational work needs to be people working with people in environments where there are things that matter and things get done that matter, which it seems, from what I've learned from Juliana, what you're trying to do in your organization. So this learning from plants, transformation, and being sensitive to contexts, responsive, and realizing that everything I'm doing, as in with the plant, is also changing the world. We're not onlookers. We're not foreign bodies on the planet, even though our thinking might be like that sometimes. How can we integrate it in creative ways, right? Creative ideas that are new, that can be alive and support life rather than being so destructive as we often are. So there's a lot to learn from plants, and I hope I've given you a little taste of that. And that's all I really have to say today.
Thank you, Craig. Well, we are at the end of our time. Maybe if there's one burning question, but I think it would be, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes, hello, this is Jade here. I have one question. So thank you very much for the lecture today. And my question is, you have been talking a lot about individual plants and how they are transforming and being transformed. But would you give us a glance of how plant as a community transform and connected to the environment?
Yeah. I mean, that you could say it's the same, it's basically the same kind of characteristics on a larger, much more complex scale. I've started with it's easy, treating plants as if they were individual, because we can look at them in one way as individuals. But of course, as I showed with the trees, they are part of a community, and that community is incredibly interwoven. Think of everything one knows about mycorrhizal, all the interactions in the soil, right? That most plants are connected with each other via fungi, so that you have this amazingly dynamic, interconnected world there that we can't really think of plants as individuals, just as together they're also all taking in, the carbon dioxide from the air and bringing out together oxygen, creating an oxygenated environment. So you have plant communities where the boundaries, between a forest and then a meadow, and you have the boundary environments, all of these things are more complex. They are harder to understand, but it's the same. We need the same way of looking in the sense of understanding togetherness, just like the parts of a plant are part of a larger whole. So every species is part of a larger whole in a community, but those communities are fluid in the sense of one moves into the other. There are no fixed boundaries, between a forest. Even a forest and a lake, there's a transition. So yes, I think it's a really important issue. And I've worked from the somewhat more simple phenomena as a preparation to the more difficult task of the larger whole, because then the whole Earth is also a differentiated organism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jade. I think it gives also a sense of furthering, but it would be to go further with this, which I think is a good note to end. And I was thinking also, you spoke, Craig, a lot about process, and I was thinking of this learning itself as a process. And I was reminded by the quote from Goethe, which I won't remember exactly how it is, but that the more we observe a plant, the more we attend carefully, we develop organs of perception in ourselves. And so this continuous work, and that happens often more invisibly than we tend to associate with learning as something that comes ready. And so how do we open ourselves to engage continuously in this kind of learning? So I was going to also then point to the Nature Institute website that has many articles and resources and videos that can be accessed also to go further in this knowledge for those who would like to, and also to remember to ask if you would like to listen to the recording, to watch the recording again of the presentation, that you can ask Natalie in the same email from which you received the link for the talk. I'm sure that listening to it again will not be a repetition, because I think there's so much in it that can help us ground all this learning. Thank you again, Craig, and I think everyone also keep in touch with with KFPG, and also in your keep an eye on your email. There may be more talks coming up in the next months.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. And one last thing, we'll be sharing the evaluation form of this talk by tomorrow. So please help us to fill in the form and let us know how use your feedback and see how we can improve our future programs. So at last, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Craig, and we hope to see each other in future programs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Juliana, do you want me to stay on? Should we stay on for